Let me ask you a very simple question. Sit with it before you answer. If your house is on fire and your neighbor keeps promising to bring you a bucket of water, but every time you look out the window, the bucket is empty, at what point do you stop calling it help? At what point do you call it what it actually is? That is the situation Volodymyr Zelensky is in right now. He is the man calling for help. Europe is the neighbor with the empty bucket. And the house is Ukraine's air defense system. And it is burning. Now, in Western media, when Zelensky makes these appeals for more air defense missiles, more Patriot interceptors, a joint European air shield, the coverage is always sympathetic. The headlines always frame him as a brave leader fighting against impossible odds. I understand that framing. I understand the emotional appeal. But I am not a journalist. I am a teacher. My job is not to make you feel something. My job is to help you understand what is actually happening. And what is actually happening is structurally very interesting and structurally very predictable. If you know how empires work, if you know how alliances work, if you understand game theory at its most basic level. So, let us start there. The free rider problem. The fundamental problem in any alliance is what economists call the free rider problem. It is not complicated. When two people are supposed to share a burden, each has an incentive to let the other carry more. Each has an incentive to contribute less and benefit more. This is not a moral failing. This is rational behavior. It is the logical outcome of how incentives are structured. NATO for 70 years has been the most elaborate free rider arrangement in human civilization. The United States provided the military muscle. Europe provided the geography, the political legitimacy, and the occasional symbolic contribution. In return, Europe got to spend its money on welfare states, healthcare, pensions, all the things that made Western European life so comfortable. The American taxpayer subsidized European security, and European voters enjoyed the benefits without paying the cost. That arrangement worked for a specific historical moment. During the Cold War, the United States needed Europe. It needed the forward bases, the political coalition, the showcase for capitalist democracy over Soviet communism. So America paid to keep the showcase looking good. But the Cold War ended, and the logic that sustained the arrangement died with it. What did not die was the habit. Europe kept enjoying American protection. America kept providing it, not because strategic logic demanded it, but because bureaucracies do not change course easily. Institutions do not dissolve themselves. Generals do not volunteer to reduce their budgets. So, the thing kept going, long past its sell-by date, powered by inertia and by the lobbying interests of the defense industrial complex on both sides of the Atlantic. Zelensky's impossible position. Now here is where Zelensky enters the picture, and here is where it gets genuinely painful to analyze, because I want to be clear. What I am about to say is not an attack on Ukraine. The Ukrainian people have suffered enormously. Their suffering is real. Their need is real. But the political and strategic reality is also real, and pretending it isn't real does not help them. It actually makes their situation worse. Zelensky has been making urgent appeals for air defense since essentially the first month of the war. Patriots, interceptor missiles, integrated air shields, systems that can shoot down ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, the Iranian-designed Shahed drones that Russia sends in swarms of 200 at a time. He has been asking for this for years, and Europe has been promising, and promising, and promising. The numbers do not lie. Let me give you the actual numbers, because numbers do not lie the way politicians do. The entire European Union, 27 countries with a combined GDP larger than China's, has a total air defense missile stockpile of roughly 3,000 warheads. That sounds like a lot until you understand the context. Russia launches ballistic missile salvos at Ukraine on a regular basis. A single Patriot battery fires multiple interceptors per incoming missile because you need redundancy. You need backup shots. You do not get a second chance if the first one misses. The consumption rate of interceptors in active combat is ferocious. In early 2026, during the American and Israeli campaign against Iran, a campaign that lasted 39 days, the combined Patriot stockpiles of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Israel were drawn down by approximately 86% in 39 days. The United States fired over 400 Patriot interceptors in just the first 16 days. THAAD inventories were depleted by 40%. This is what missile consumption looks like in a real high-intensity conflict. Europe has 3,000 interceptors for the whole continent, and they do not want to give them to Ukraine. Not because they are cruel, not because they do not care, but because they are sitting in countries that have their own threat calculations to make. Poland is looking east at Russia and Belarus, thinking, if I give these missiles to Ukraine and Ukraine falls, what do I have left? The Baltic states are making the same calculation. Germany is making the same calculation. Every country is doing the math and arriving at the same answer. We cannot afford to give what we do not have enough of ourselves. What Zelensky actually receives. So what does Zelensky actually get when he stands at a summit and calls for a joint European air defense system? He gets communiques, declarations of solidarity, photo opportunities with prime ministers and chancellors who look very serious and very concerned, promises of future cooperation, future joint production, future integrated systems. He gets everything except the thing he actually needs, missiles that can shoot down Russian ballistic projectiles tonight. The British case study. Now let us talk about Britain specifically, because the British situation is particularly revealing of how this whole game is being played. After Brexit, Britain had a problem. It had spent 50 years as the most important American proxy inside the European Union, the country that carried American preferences into European councils, the transatlantic bridge. Then Brexit happened, and Britain lost its institutional leverage inside Europe. It needed a new role, a new strategic identity. Ukraine gave Britain that identity. Britain was one of the first countries to commit significant military support. It trained Ukrainian soldiers. It sent long-range Storm Shadow missiles when others were still debating helmets. Britain positioned itself as the most committed, the most forward-leaning, the most serious European military power. That positioning served British interests. It gave Britain relevance, a seat at the table. It justified Britain's defense budget in the eyes of the British public. But here is the thing. Positioning and capability are two very different things. Britain can position itself as the leader of European security. It can make the speeches, sign the joint declarations. But Britain also does not have an infinite supply of interceptors. Its own air defense is not overflowing with surplus capacity. Britain is not manufacturing Patriot missiles. It is not going to single-handedly fill the hole that America's pivot to the Middle East has created. What Britain can do, and what it has done, is make announcements. Joint this, integrated that, European air shield, cooperation with France, cooperation with Germany, beautiful language, impressive language, the kind that generates headlines and reassures Western audiences that Europe is stepping up. But the actual hardware, the interceptors, the systems capable of shooting down Iskander ballistic missiles, traveling at 10 times the speed of sound, that hardware does not materialize just because a prime minister says it should exist. Europe's 30-year holiday. And this is where we need to talk about the deeper structural failure, because the real story is not actually about Zelensky, and it is not even about Ukraine. The real story is about the 30-year holiday that Europe took from strategic seriousness. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Europe made a decision, not explicitly, not in any single summit or treaty, but as a collective behavioral choice. Europe decided that the era of great power conflict was over. That history had in some sense ended, that the future was expanding trade, expanding integration, expanding prosperity. The military became an afterthought, a legacy institution, something you maintained at minimal levels because the alliance required it, but not something you actually invested in or took seriously. Germany is the most dramatic example, the largest economy in Europe, the country most exposed to Russian pressure through its energy dependence and geographic centrality. Germany spent years deliberately keeping its military in a state of managed decline. Not enough transport helicopters, not enough ammunition, not enough readiness. The Bundeswehr became a running joke inside NATO. Generals would privately say that Germany could not sustain a serious combat operation for more than a few days before running out of basic supplies. France did better. France kept a serious military, but oriented toward power projection. Africa, the Middle East. Expeditionary operations that preserve great power status. France's military was not designed for the attritional, industrial-scale warfare unfolding on the Ukrainian steppe. So, when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Europe woke up to a very uncomfortable reality. It had been sleepwalking for 30 years. The warehouses were empty. The production lines had been wound down, or never built. The industrial base for high-end military equipment, missiles, interceptors, radar systems, had atrophied. And you cannot rebuild that in a year. You cannot rebuild it in 2 years. These things take time, investment, political will sustained over years, not months. The gap between announcement and capability. Now some of you are thinking, but wait. Europe has been rearming. Germany announced a massive defense budget increase. The EU launched its Rearm Europe program. Isn't that the response? Yes and no. Yes, the announcements are real. Yes, the budget commitments are real. But there is a gap, a very significant gap, between announcing a budget and having the capability. You cannot write a check today and have Patriot interceptors tomorrow. The production line does not care about your press release. Lockheed Martin, which makes the PA-C3 interceptor, the missile actually useful against ballistic threats, has a stated goal of tripling production by 2033, 7 years from now. The target they are aiming for 7 years from now is 2,000 interceptors per year. That is the aspiration. Meanwhile, global consumption in active conflict theaters is already straining that pipeline from the demand side. And Zelensky is standing at summits with German chancellors and British prime ministers, talking about joint production, a European Patriot equivalent, an integrated continental air defense architecture. All of that is genuinely worth building. Long-term investment in European defense industrial capacity is the correct strategic response. But it does not help Ukraine right now. It does not intercept the Iskander heading toward Kharkiv tonight. Game theory in 3 players. Let me give you the game theory framing because it clarifies what is actually happening very efficiently. Think of the situation as a game with 3 players: Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. Each player is trying to optimize its own outcome. Ukraine's strategy is straightforward: maximum pressure on Western partners for maximum military support as quickly as possible. That means Zelensky makes urgent, dramatic appeals. He publicly highlights every shortage, every failure, every gap. This is rational behavior. This is what any leader in his position would do. Europe's strategy is more complicated. Europe wants Ukraine to survive, genuinely. A Ukrainian defeat would be a catastrophic signal about the credibility of Western security guarantees. It would validate Russian aggression, destabilize the eastern flank. But Europe also does not want to exhaust its own defensive capacity. It does not want to empty its magazines to save Ukraine and then find itself exposed to the next phase of Russian pressure. So, Europe's strategy is make large promises, deliver modest amounts, rearm slowly, and hope the situation resolves itself through negotiation before the contradiction between promises and deliveries becomes too obvious to ignore. The United States under the current administration has changed its strategy fundamentally. The Trump administration made a clear choice. Ukraine is a European problem. America's primary theaters are now the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. The Iran campaign consumed enormous quantities of interceptors. Those stockpiles need to be reconstituted, and the Pentagon's priority list has Ukraine very far down it. The language out of Washington, "we will find a way to help," is not the language of commitment. It is the language of vague goodwill with no deadline and no accountability. So you have Ukraine making urgent demands, Europe making generous-sounding promises it cannot fully keep, and America retreating from the commitment it once made. And in the middle of this 3-player game, the actual missile gap, the shortage of interceptors that can shoot down ballistic missiles, grows wider every month. Ukraine is losing the air defense war. What does this mean for Ukraine? I want to be honest with you. Ukraine is losing the air defense war, not the whole war, not necessarily. But on this specific dimension, the ability to protect its cities and infrastructure from Russian ballistic missile attacks, Ukraine is in an increasingly difficult position. Zelensky has said it himself. The shortage could not be any worse. That is a president admitting publicly that his country's air shield is failing, and the consequences are not abstract. Power stations, water treatment facilities, apartment buildings. These are the targets of Russian ballistic missile salvos, When the air defense fails, these things get hit. When these things get hit, the civilian population suffers. And when the population suffers enough, the political pressure to accept whatever terms Russia is willing to offer becomes harder to resist. Russia understands this. Russia's ballistic missile campaign is not just military, it is economic, it is political. It is a strategy to make the cost of continuing the war unbearable for Ukrainian society. And the air defense shortage makes that strategy more effective every week. Where does this end? Now, where does this end? What does the game predict? I want to be careful, because prediction is not prophecy. I am not telling you what will happen. I am telling you what the structural logic suggests is likely. The structural logic suggests that Europe will continue to rearm, but slowly. The joint European air defense architecture that Zelensky is calling for will eventually be built, but on a timeline of years, not months. In the near term, Ukraine will have to do more with less. It will have to make triage decisions about which cities and which targets to prioritize defending, and which to leave exposed. Russia knows this. Russia will continue to exploit this window, this period when Ukraine's air defense is degraded and Europe's rearmament is incomplete, to press its military and political objectives. What could change this logic? A genuine dramatic acceleration of European defense industrial production. A political decision in multiple European capitals to prioritize Ukrainian air defense, even at the cost of their own stockpile levels. A technological breakthrough in cheaper, faster-to-produce interceptor alternatives. Or a negotiated settlement that stops the missile attacks by ending the conflict. All of these are possible. None of them are certain, and none of them are being driven by the speeches Zelensky gives at EU summits, however eloquent those speeches may be. The neighbor with the empty bucket. Let me come back to where I started, the neighbor with the empty bucket. The neighbor is not a villain. The neighbor is not malicious. The neighbor is genuinely distressed by the fire. The neighbor makes real efforts, calls the fire department, fills the bucket halfway, makes very passionate statements about the importance of fire prevention and the necessity of solidarity with burning houses. But the house is still burning, and at some point, this is the hard truth. The question is not whether Europe's intentions are good. The question is whether Europe's capacity matches the scale of the crisis. And right now, structurally, it does not. Not because Europeans are bad people, but because 30 years of strategic complacency cannot be undone in 30 months. The bill for the post-Cold War holiday is now coming due, and it is arriving faster than anyone expected, in a form that nobody fully prepared for. Zelensky is not begging uselessly because he is weak. He is begging because he is a rational actor who understands that this is his only available lever. He cannot manufacture Patriot interceptors. He cannot force European defense industries to produce faster. He cannot compel America to reprioritize Ukraine over its specific commitments. All he can do is make the case, loudly and repeatedly, and hope that political pressure accumulates into actual deliveries. Whether it will happen fast enough to matter, that is the question the next several months will answer, and I think you already sense what the answer is likely to be. Watch this space, because this story is not over. And the next chapter is going to be very consequential, not just for Ukraine, but for the future of European security, for the credibility of Western alliances, and for the question of whether the liberal international order that the West spent 70 years building can actually defend itself when the moment requires it. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.